Rachel Howard. She is a junior at Pomona College and she is studying cognitive science and classics. She's also a Menlo alumna of 2018. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be with you all today. I was really involved in JCL when I was in high school, so it's pretty cool to be back here and speaking with all of you about some of the things I've been thinking about after high school and in college. So I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Okay, so there we go. Okay, you should hopefully be able to see that. So today I'm going to be talking about this question of whose art is it? So this is kind of related to, which country should these pieces belong to? Where should they be displayed? Who should have the power to make those decisions about where these pieces are displayed? And so really what this question is about is kind of, there's a lot of pieces in the modern period that have been looted from archaeological sites or taken in various illicit ways, that it's pretty easy to make an argument that they should be back in the countries in which they originated. However, as you go further back in history and start to look at empires who conquered, vast areas of land, such as the Roman Empire, it becomes very difficult to try and understand or try and make a decision as easily as it would be for pieces in the modern period. So first I want to take a look at art looted in the modern period. Probably one of the most famous examples is that of the Parthenon Marbles. So the picture at the bottom of the slide is a picture of the Parthenon in Athens, Greece, as it is seen today. It is a large temple dedicated to Athena, which used to have sculptures all around the top part and on the pediment of the building. And so early in the 19th century, archaeologists from Britain came to the Parthenon and selected various pieces of the frieze and various sculptures, which they sent back to Britain. And these pieces formed the basis for the British Museum in London. And that is still where a lot of these pieces reside today. However, these pictures are of a museum which was opened in 2009. It's the Acropolis Museum. And an entire floor of this museum is dedicated to housing and presenting the sculptures from the Parthenon. And so, as you can see, there's kind of sculptures that go all around this building. The big windows in the background of the picture on the left look out to the Parthenon. And so you can actually see, while you're looking at these pieces that used to be on the building, you can see the remainder of what of the temple is left. And so this museum really provides a lot of archaeological context for these pieces, because you can see where these pieces were originally meant to be located, but they're also being protected from the elements and being protected for future generations to be able to see. The other cool thing about this museum is that they've laid out all the sculptures in the way that they were originally laid out on the Parthenon itself. Obviously, they're a lot closer to the ground than they would have been, but kind of in the linear pattern, they are a representation of where they would have been attached to the building. However, like I had said, many of the original sculptures from the building still remain in the British Museum in London. And the Acropolis Museum actually has a lot of models of these. So they do not have all the originals, even though it is a museum that is almost directly next to the temple itself. And so part of the goal of the construction of this museum was to assert that these pieces should really be back in Greece where they were originally intended to be. and where they have the best archaeological context and where they add to the culture and the history of the place. And so, this is a very good argument that this museum makes in terms of trying to display to England and the rest of the world that these pieces really should be back in Greece. So bringing it a little bit closer to home, this is a picture of the Getty's Aphrodite. I put Aphrodite in quotes because it turns out that this statue is probably a lot more likely to be a statue of Hera than of Aphrodite. It was a statue purchased by the Getty in 1988 and displayed in the Getty Villa, which is in Southern California. And at the time it was purchased, it had really questionable provenance. And so provenance in archaeological terms means the kind of earliest known history or location of this artifact. And so this statue, it was pretty uncertain where exactly it had come from. It just kind of had shown up in Switzerland and was put on the art market and then later purchased by the Getty. Which indicated to a lot of people that it was probably illicitly stolen from an archaeological site, which indeed was deemed to be true. People found out that this was probably a statue looted from the site of Morgantina in Sicily, and so was eventually returned to Italy in 2010. And so there's a lot of problems with this illicit looting of archaeological sites in the modern day. Many places, many pieces in museums have ended up coming from illicit looting of these sites. But it's very complicated because we lose so much historical context that we would otherwise get from these pieces. So in an archaeological site, archaeologists tend to take very, very detailed notes as to what they're excavating. So they, if they were excavating this specific statue, they would have said, okay, this is exactly where it is, the depth, what else is around it and where. And that gives us so much more information than just the carvings as to what the significance of the statue might have been. It might be able to tell us, what was the purpose of it, who made it, and various other things that could be interesting to know. However, when these are illicitly taken, they lose pretty much all of that outside context, and all we have is the piece of stone and the sculpture itself. And so that does really take away a lot of the historical context that we could get from these. So the last two examples I gave you were both from the modern period. And I would say that it's pretty easy to see that, there are very good arguments as to why these pieces should be back in the countries that they originated in or that they were founded. But excuse me, it gets a lot more complicated when we go back further in history and look at art looted prior to the modern period. So this is a picture that you're probably all pretty familiar with. It is the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. As we all know, the Roman Empire was incredibly vast. They conquered just incredible amounts of territory and expanded throughout the entire Mediterranean. And so kind of within this, they would conquer people and they would take a lot of their things. They would take their sculptures and their art and their artifacts and bring them back to Rome and disperse them kind of throughout the empire. One of the really common things that would happen in Rome after conquering a group of people would be a triumphal procession. And so how this worked is that a general or the emperor would parade through the city of Rome, both people who had been conquered as well as these spoils of war. So really impressive art and artifacts that these people had held dear to them. And so in a way, this helped, to symbolize the power of Rome and to have Roman citizens feel pride in their empire and in their homeland. And then eventually these pieces would tend to get kind of dispersed to various elite Romans as decorations and kind of gained this new cultural life in a different part of the empire than where they had originated. Secondly, a lot of the Roman art that we know today is termed Greco-Roman, referring to the fusion of Roman and Greek artistic styles. And so this kind of refers to after Rome conquered Greece, they took a lot of their art. And not only did they take full pieces, but they also took a lot of the ideas of these pieces and incorporated them into future Roman art. And so it does become very difficult to disentangle these threads of Greek versus Roman, and it becomes a very mixed cultural experience. But now I'm going to move a little bit further ahead in history, a little bit past the classical period. And this is going to be a little bit more specific example. And so to understand this, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Crusades. And so this example that I'm talking about comes from the Crusades, which were religious wars waged during the medieval period, which were initiated and supported by the Latin Church. And they were waged between about the 11th and the 13th centuries CE. And these were wars originally waged to try and take back the Holy Lands from the Muslims, as well as to try and stem the rise of Islam. And then one more factoid about the Crusades is that Crusaders would typically wear a cross to represent their allegiance to the church. And so the specific crusade that I'm talking about is the Fourth Crusade. And Venice played a really big role in this crusade. And honestly, their history was shaped quite distinctly by what happened in this. And so at the time of the Fourth Crusade, which was the early 13th century, Venice was becoming a very strong naval power. Being on the ocean, being on the water, they had a lot of access to ships and just had a lot of naval force. And so the Doge of Venice, who was the leader of Venice, had made an agreement with the Pope to transport crusaders in exchange for a form of payment. So the Doge essentially said, you know, I will provide you with these ships and we will get you to where you need to go on your crusade. You provide us the crusaders and this form of payment in exchange for the services we're providing you. And so when the crusaders finally arrived, there were actually many fewer than the number that had been agreed upon and a much smaller payment. So the Doge said, no, we're not going to do this anymore. This is not what we agreed to. And so essentially kind of said, no, we're not going to transport you. And so in comes a man by the name of Alexius Angelos, who was attempting to overthrow the emperor of Constantinople to place himself on the throne. And so he came in with a deal for Venice that he would pay a much higher sum of money than the Pope had initially agreed to, including spoils of war from Constantinople. And he also agreed that if they were to help him overthrow the emperor of Constantinople, that he would have the Byzantines swear allegiance to the Catholic Church. And so Venice agrees to this, and they sail to Constantinople and essentially wage this battle, this war, which ends in 3 days of looting of the city, where many pieces of art and artifacts were either taken or destroyed. And so the story of the Fourth Crusade itself is kind of interesting. But what I was really looking at this is what happened to these artifacts? How did they impact Venice, and how did they impact Venice's future after the Fourth Crusade? So a lot of these artifacts ended up here. This is the Piazza San Marco in Venice. It is the kind of main town square of the city, and it is dedicated to the patron saint, Saint Mark. And so what happened to a lot of the things taken from Constantinople is that they ended up in this square, decorating the square, decorating the basilica, and really exemplifying the power of Venice and the power of their patron saint, Saint Mark. And so these are a couple of examples of the artifacts that were taken. These are the 4 bronze horses. They were initially placed outside of the basilica, decorating kind of the roof area, which you can see in the right-hand picture. Those are now a replica of it that currently resides there. And the original, which you can see on the left-hand side, resides inside the basilica to protect it from the elements. Now, these pictures, the one on the left is a statue of the 4 tetrarchs, also taken from Constantinople. And the one on the right is a series of various colored columns and pillars. And so the pillars, I believe, were taken from Constantinople, and then the columns, typically various colors in columns in the ancient world, indicates that they were taken from many different areas. So again, it is a display of power and the ability of an empire or of a group of people to get these resources from a variety of areas. And so again, this is just kind of this mixing of all of these things from different areas in Venice. And so looking at Venice before and after the Fourth Crusade, as I already mentioned, prior to the Fourth Crusade, Venice was becoming a very strong power as an empire, both in naval power and in commerce. And after the Fourth Crusade, they used a lot of the spoils of war to display the wealth and power of Venice and their patron saint. A lot of these pieces helped to merge Byzantine artifacts and Byzantine styles into the Western culture, which was typically more of a classical style. And so even in Venice today, we see a lot of more Eastern styles mixed with the typical classical style that we expect from much of the rest of Italy. And then these pieces were kind of displayed in the public, displayed in the piazza, to be seen by people. And they became very ingrained in Venice's culture. But they also meant a lot to the Byzantine people who they were taken from. I would like to read you a quote from a member of Emperor John VIII's retinue. Emperor John VIII was a Byzantine emperor who visited Venice in the 15th century, so about 200 years after the Fourth Crusade. And this quote says, "Among the people who contemplate this icon of icons, those who own it feel pride, pleasure, and delectation, while those from whom it was taken, if they happen to be present, as in our case, see it as an object of sadness, sorrow, and dejection." And so what I want you to get from that paragraph is that these are very, very emotionally strong words that are being used to describe these objects. Venetians feel pride, pleasure, and delectation. These are very, very strong positive emotions that they feel for these pieces that have now become this symbol of Venice, and this symbol of their culture, and things honoring their patron saint. But at the same time, Byzantines feel sadness, sorrow, and dejection about these pieces. They still feel this strong connection to them even after 200 years, and feel this incredible sadness at them having been taken from their culture. And so even after just 200 years, we can see that these pieces are, becoming something that is so strongly ingrained in both cultures. And even at this point of 200 years, it's kind of difficult to tell, should the Venetians have these, or should these be returned to Constantinople? And so before we return to that question, I wanted to take a look at how these artifacts get represented in the present day. And so the idea behind this was to try and see how people present the history of these artifacts and the history of Venice, because it's kind of an ugly history. And often as humans, we have a hard time presenting that history and acknowledging that history. And so this first one is from a book called The Genius of Venice. It says, Venice experienced an architectural and artistic proto-Renaissance as early as the 12th and 13th centuries. This is when she first created Piazza San Marco, using as her model a splendid late classical square in Constantinople, the old imperial capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The book presents the piazza as one of the supreme examples of Western communal art, the same architectural ethos that built the great medieval cathedrals of France and Germany. The work of architects and artists of great genius and skill. The Piazza Ensemble is, above all, a communal artistic effort, a carefully crafted assemblage, merging changes in style and taste over 800 years. And so, as you can see from this paragraph, it's kind of acknowledged that a lot of these this mixing of cultures and styles occurred. But from this paragraph, it seems like it was a very collaborative space, rather than, these ideas were taken by force and by us conquering your city and destroying it for 3 days. It kind of ignores that ugly history, while also kind of acknowledging a little bit the mix of cultures that has occurred. Which does make a lot of sense. As I mentioned, as humans, we really struggle to acknowledge the ugly histories of the places that we're from. I think every culture struggles to acknowledge that. And so this one's another one from the travel guide Rick Steves. He writes, the marble mosaics on the church's floor were, quote, inherited. Venetians have a tough time saying looted from Constantinople. And the picture on the left is an example of one of these mosaics with a couple of birds. And so the kind of choice of language here is very interesting that he chooses to use, where Venetians choose to say a word that's more along the lines of inherited rather than looted. Looted to me has a connotation of, it's something that's stolen, it doesn't belong to you, it doesn't really mean anything to you, and it meant a lot more to the people who you took it from. However, as we could see from that initial paragraph that I read you, even after just 200 years, these artifacts were becoming things that were so important to the Venetian culture, while at the same time remaining important to Byzantine culture. And so a word like inherited feels a lot more like it is important to both cultures. And so is something that is ingrained within the stories of both. So now returning back to this question about whose art is it, I think it's pretty fair to say that art looted in the modern period is tended to be viewed as belonging to the original country, in that the original country should be able to make decisions as to how it's displayed or where it is, because it's a part of their cultural history. And losing it and having it stolen from them kind of takes away from that cultural heritage. However, as you go back further in history, it really does become a lot more complicated of a question. Much of the art looted from the Fourth Crusade still resides in Venice, and no one really questions about returning it to Istanbul. This is art that has become a really prized piece of Venetian culture. It has been there for over 800 years, just as long or longer than it was originally in Constantinople. And so these pieces are something that really is integral to both cultures. And it is hard to say who, it is nearly impossible to say that, it belongs completely to you and not to the other culture. either way you go with that, whether you're saying, it belongs to Venice or it belongs to Istanbul, it does make it very difficult to answer that question. And as we also know, empires throughout history were shaped through looting other lands. The Roman Empire especially grew vast amounts of territory by conquering other people and redistributing their artwork and their wealth throughout the rest of the empire. And all of these pieces tended to shape the histories of both locations. Not only were they important pieces of the places that they came from, but they became very important pieces of the places that they ended up in and the places in which they had almost a new cultural life. And so this question of whose art is it does become something that is very challenging to answer. Because, I can't say that, the Istanbul shouldn't have any connection to this art and Venice should have all of it, because it really has been an important piece of cultural history for both places. And as of course it's art, it can't be in two places at once. And so these are just interesting questions that we can start to ask about these. So I really appreciate you all taking your time to listen to this. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability.
I have a question. What interested you to cover this topic, or what made you interested in discussing artifacts and all the stuff presented?
Yeah. So this project came from a course called Archaeology and Society, which I took at Pomona. And in this class, we were really trying to dive into the questions of, what kind of made us a little bit uncomfortable about the museum industry or about archaeology, and the things that were more challenging. We talked about a lot of case studies that were kind of unclear like this. So for example, the Getty's Aphrodite, the entire museum industry has really benefited a lot from illicit looting. And it's something that, is a very difficult question to answer with that. And so this was my final project for that class. And I was just, really interested in diving into those questions more as to what makes archaeology challenging and what makes the history and the things that we display more difficult.
I have a question. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Museums such as the Getty in California, have you been there, and what do you think about, since you're learning about all this, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I have been to the Getty. I have not been since thinking more about this topic. This was definitely something that until it was presented to me in a classroom setting, I wasn't really incredibly aware of it. I think we often will, we'll take, textbooks or take museum displays at their word without kind of questioning the biases that come from them. And this was definitely something that I'm still learning how to do and how to pick apart and question, because often if you have a gut feeling about something, this kind of quite doesn't make sense, oftentimes that leads you on a correct path. And so I would be really interested in going back to museums kind of after the pandemic and going back to the Getty and looking at this kind of through the lens of knowing what I know now. But yeah, I definitely would love to do that and have not been since thinking about these questions more.
Sorry, I have another question. What was the research process like? Was it really difficult to kind of, like you said, pick apart the biases and first, what are they called? Primary sources and accounts, because So yeah, like what was that like, and was it more difficult than you thought?
Yeah, so part of what my professor really encouraged in this class is just kind of bringing up things in discussion that we didn't quite feel comfortable about. And so that was kind of the first step, was like using our intuition to try and, determine these things, and to try and see, this is something that I feel like doesn't make sense, even though people are telling me that this seems correct, but it doesn't feel correct to me. What can I do to look into that more? And so that's kind of intuition building that definitely takes a lot of practice. I am like, that was probably, at least in this specific area, one of my first forays into really trying to be open about those questions and listening to my intuition. And so that takes a lot of practice. And then also, yeah, research is definitely an interesting challenge. I think for things like this, specifically, this is some of the more kind of famous examples. Some of my classmates had, mentioned like, oh, these pieces in Venice are actually from Constantinople. They weren't originally Venetian pieces. Maybe you should look into that. And so I just kind of went from there. And, you just kind of try and follow down the paths and see, from primary sources, looking at secondary sources, what they've sorted or what they've cited in their research, and just kind of trying to dig into that. And yeah, it's not always easy. I would say research is definitely something that takes a lot of practice. Okay, well, if there aren't any more questions, I will let you all go. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you taking your time. Yeah, have a good rest of the convention.
Thank you so much.
This was pretty poggers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Have a
much.
nice
This
day.
was really interesting. Have a good one.
We took students to Athens 3 years ago, and the Acropolis Museum is really amazing.
Yeah, that was
mean-
McGiss also took, I was with McGiss, Dobby, on her trip a couple years ago, and that also really got me engaged in some of these topics. Is like,
Well, they're very open about their reason.
yes.
And, yeah. So yeah, thank you. That was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening.
I don't know if anyone had anything else to say, but I'm sorry. So I'm on the student paper at this Miramani, which is a school that's participating in the JCL convention. And I was hoping I could ask you just like 2 questions, if that's all right with you.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, great. So could you just tell me, like, have you had any experience with like Latin conventions before? Have you done this before? Or like, if you haven't, why did you choose to speak here?
Yeah, so I was a Menlo alum. I graduated in 2018, and that year I helped to run the state convention at Menlo, and was super involved with that. Was involved with Menlo JCL for essentially all of my time in high school there. And yeah, it was just a really fun community, and so it's good to be back.
That is so cool. That's really cool that you're an alum. Also, just thoughts on having the convention virtual this year?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited that it's still happening. I think it's really cool to be able to get so many Colloquia speakers. This is definitely something that I couldn't have done if it were in person, because I'm in school right now. And so, yeah, I think it's really, there's a lot of things about, being in person for convention that are really amazing. I mean, it's super cool to have so many classicists in one place and just, hundreds of students dressed up in togas in a gym. Like, that's pretty cool. but there's a lot of opportunities also that we have with virtual in being able to kind of bring in more people and bring in more knowledge that wouldn't otherwise be able to happen at a convention.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. That presentation was amazing. Have a good one.
Yeah, thank you so much. You too.
Yeah, good job. That went really well. So if you could just send me the recording once we end the call, it should like appear.
Sounds good.
That'd be great. Thank you.